Starting at a very early age, Susan Smith suffered unspeakable tragedy. Her father killed himself when she was just 6 years old, and she tried to follow suit at age 13. After her mother remarried, Smith's new stepfather began to molest her. Plagued by lifelong trauma, she married David Smith at 19 to start a family of her own. But in 1994, she destroyed her own family when she murdered her children. David and Susan Smith had a rocky relationship plagued by mutual infidelity. Meanwhile, David had no idea that she suffered from depression and dependent personality disorder. He also didn't know that his wife had been dumped by a wealthy South Carolina man because he didn't want kids. This is what prompted Susan Smith to drown her own children. One day in October 1994, Susan Smith's kids, 3-year-old Michael and 14-month-old Alexander, joined her for a drive. But then, she purposefully rolled her car into John D. Long Lake in Union County, South Carolina, and left them to die. What's more, she told police that a black man had carjacked her with the children inside. But eventually, her lies came crashing down, and the horrible truth about what happened to Susan Smith's children was revealed. Born on September 26, 1971, in Union, South Carolina, Susan Lee Vaughn was the youngest of 3 children and the only girl. Tragedy struck in 1977 when her father, Harry Ray, committed suicide. Susan navigated that grief by keeping his coin collection and an audio recording of her father's voice, but tried to kill herself at 13. When her mother, Linda, married Beverly Russell Jr., it seemed the family's luck was looking up. A divorced father of 3, Russell was a thriving stockbroker and a member of both South Carolina's Republican community and the Christian Coalition. At home, however, he was molesting his 15-year-old stepdaughter, fondling her breasts and genitals. Susan told her high school guidance counselor and her mother about the abuse in 1987, when she was 16. Linda confronted her husband about it. He swore to never do it again and agreed to family therapy, but then kept abusing Susan, who revealed as much in February 1988. Later that year, she attempted suicide yet again. Working part-time at a Winn-Dixie supermarket, Susan was overwhelmed after an older married coworker broke off an affair with her and swallowed an overdose of aspirin in an attempt at self-harm. Doctors diagnosed her with an adjustment disorder and blamed her behavior on stress. In 1989, Susan Vaughn told her psychiatrist that her affair with her stepfather was consensual. Susan said she wasn't happy about her mother receiving all the male attention. She would ultimately find a partner in David Smith, a fellow Winn-Dixie supermarket worker, who was raised a Jehovah's Witness by strict parents. They got married after only about a year of dating. The 19-year-old bride was already 2 months pregnant with her first son, Michael, while her 20-year-old groom lost a brother to Crohn's disease and had his father attempt suicide within a year. They both came from families tormented by tragedy, but their own family would prove to be an unhappy one as well. Almost as soon as they were wed, the Smiths would begin relentlessly arguing and cheating on each other. Susan Smith's most intense extramarital affair was with a newfound employee at Conso Products in 1993. She began sleeping with her boss's son, Tom Finlay, in January 1994. But the rich, handsome 27-years-old broke things off with her in October, writing Smith a letter clarifying he wasn't ready for a relationship involving kids. On October 25th, they had a particularly upsetting conversation. Finlay recalled Smith being upset because David knew, or so she thought, some information that he was going to make public that upset her. It's unclear just what this was, while it would later be revealed that Smith had continued having sexual relations with her former stepfather. Then, after insulting Finlay by claiming she slept with his father, he asked her to leave. 3 hours later, she decided that if Finlay didn't want kids, she was going to get her own children out of the picture. Just 3 hours later, Susan Smith put her kids in her 1990 Mazda Protege and set out for a drive. As she approached John D. Long Lake, she rolled her car straight into the water, then fled the scene and left her 2 children to drown. She then reported her car stolen and her children missing, even pretending that a black man had carjacked her and abducted her sons. For 9 days, she went on television, pleading tearfully for their safe return. But on November 3rd, with police suspicious of her flimsy story, Smith finally relented and confessed about what she'd done. Her trial began soon after. Smith's defense attorney, David Bruck, argued that her actions were rooted in mental illness spurred by the suicide of her father, sexual abuses, and emotional rejections. Lead prosecutor Thomas Pope painted a very different picture. He claimed Smith was a murderous manipulator who killed her children to regain Finlay's affections. Apparently unconvinced by Smith's defense, the jury deliberated for 2.5 hours on July 22, 1995, and quickly found her guilty. Convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder, Susan Smith was sentenced to life in prison. Today, Susan Smith is incarcerated at Leith Correctional Institution in Greenwood, South Carolina. Her behavior behind bars has only made her more infamous, as she's been caught smoking marijuana and sleeping with a correctional officer. She broke her decades-long silence in 2015 via a letter. "It has been hard to listen to lie after lie and not be able to defend myself," the letter read. "It's frustrating to say the least. The thing that hurts me the most is that people think that I hurt my children in order to be with a man. That is so far from the truth. There was no motive, as it was not even a planned event. I was not in my right mind." Even now, Susan Smith maintains that it was only a temporary, albeit violent, break from her normal mental state that caused her to harm her children. Though the court of public opinion has largely sided with the prosecution, the state will have to actually consider Smith's pleas in 2024, when she'll be eligible for parole. In 1991, Shonda Scherer was a bubbly 12-year-old attending Hazelwood Middle School in New Albany, Indiana. She was, by all accounts, a normal girl who made friends easily and had fun at school dances. But it was one such dance that set in motion a chain of events that would soon bring Shonda Scherer's life to a gruesome, torturous end at the hands of 4 teenage girls. Shonda Scherer met classmate Amanda Heverin at Hazelwood in 1991, soon after moving to the area with her recently divorced mother from Kentucky. Shonda and Heverin became fast friends and then romantic partners. In October of that year, the pair attended a school dance together. There, Scherer and Heverin were confronted by 16-year-old Melinda Loveless, who had previously been dating Heverin for more than a year and was now extremely jealous of this new pairing. Loveless then threatened Scherer in public and soon even talked about killing the 12-year-old. At this point, Scherer's mother transferred her to Our Lady of Perpetual Help Catholic School in order to protect her. Unfortunately, that did nothing to stop the horrific events that would soon unfold. On the cold winter night of January 10, 1992, Loveless enlisted 3 friends, Lori Tackett, 17, Hope Rippey, 15, and Tony Lawrence, 15, to help her take her revenge on Shonda Scherer. The foursome drove to where Scherer was spending the weekend with her father. The girls used the pretense that they were taking Scherer to see Heverin as the excuse for their visit. Shonda told the girls to return after her parents were asleep, which they did. The girls then took Scherer into their car and told her they were going to drive her to the meeting place at the Witch's Castle, an isolated and abandoned house that served as a local teen hangout. In the back seat, Melinda Loveless was hiding under a blanket with a knife. The ringleader and jealous lover soon leapt out from under the blanket and threatened to slit Scherer's throat if she didn't confess to stealing Heverin away from her. In tears and fearful for her life, Scherer tried to respond, but to no avail. Lovelace then convinced the other girls to take Scherer to a remote location where there would be no one else around for miles. The 3 other girls assumed Lovelace was simply going to scare Scherer into breaking up with Hevron. They were dead wrong. For 7 hours, the 4 girls brutally tortured Shonda Scherer before ultimately killing her. First, they took Scherer to a remote trash dump near a logging road in a densely forested area. Lovelace and Tackett stripped off Scherer's clothes and proceeded to punch her repeatedly. Lovelace hit the victim's face with her knee until she bled profusely from her mouth. Meanwhile, Lawrence and Rippey stayed behind in Tackett's car. That torture wasn't enough to satiate the older girls. They then tried to slit Scherer's throat, but the knife was too dull. Instead, they stabbed her in the chest and strangled her with a rope before throwing her in the trunk of the car, thinking she was dead. They then went to Tackett's house to clean up and drink sodas, before realizing that their victim, now screaming in the trunk, was still alive. Tackett proceeded to stab Scherer several more times before driving off once more with Lovelace to beat and sodomize Scherer with a tire iron. When they returned to Tackett's house, she laughingly described what had just happened to Rippey. Finally, in the early morning hours, the torturers stopped at a gas station and bought a 2-liter bottle of Pepsi, which they quickly emptied and refilled with gasoline. Again, driving to a remote location, the girls hauled their still-alive victim, now only able to whimper mommy, out of the trunk, wrapped her in a blanket, and poured the gasoline on her. Then they lit Shonda Scherer on fire and drove off. Just to be sure their work was finished, Lovelace had them return a few minutes later to pour some more gasoline on her, watch her writhe in agony, and finally confirm that she was dead. As the 4 girls ate breakfast at McDonald's just after the killing, the 4 girls laughed as they compared their sausage breakfast to Shonda Scherer's burnt corpse. Later that morning, 2 hunters found the body. That same day, the girls started talking. Lovelace told Hevron and another friend the whole story, but had them promise to keep their mouths shut. But that night, Lawrence and Rippey went straight to the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office with their parents and spilled the whole story. By the next day, all 4 girls were in custody. All 4 girls were tried as adults and accepted plea bargains in order to avoid the death penalty. Lawrence and Rippey, younger, less involved in the torture, and more forthcoming with authorities, received lighter sentences, with Lawrence getting 20 years and Rippey getting 50, shortened to 35 on appeal. The former was released in 2000 after serving 9 years, while the latter served 14 and got out in 2006. Meanwhile, Tackett and Lovelace both received 60-year sentences. Lovelace, the one angry with Scherer and the ringleader behind the murder, naturally received a longer sentence than the 2 younger girls. But why would Tackett take so much to the killing and earn herself the longer sentence as well? Tackett grew up in a strict religious household where normal teenager things were not welcome behaviors. As a way of rebelling against her parents, the youngster shaved her head and started to engage in occult practices. Tackett told people in one interview that, "I didn't know Shonda at all. I didn't go into that evening knowing anything was going to happen. Wanting anything to happen, I didn't. Peer pressure. That's all it was. It spiraled out of control way too fast. It's something that should have never happened." Furthermore, in an interview on Dr. Phil, the convicted killer explained why she thinks people kill. "My opinion is that they kill to feel superior, or high on the victim's fear, and they're thirsty for the spill of blood." Dr. Phil asked Lori's mother and sister if they agreed with that statement, and they said yes. Her mom said that her daughter believed it was her destiny that she would murder someone in cold blood and spend the rest of her life in prison. Her prediction was partly true. While Tackett did have a hand in killing Shonda Scherer, she was released from prison in January 2018. Tackett's motives aside, what would drive 16-year-old Lovelace to mastermind such a brutal murder? As Shonda Scherer's mother, Jacques Vaught, said in a 2012 interview, I had many times said, if you want to see as close to a person who has absolutely nothing inside of them, look into Melinda's eyes because there's nothing there. That said, Loveless did have a difficult childhood. Her father, a Vietnam veteran, sexually abused her and her siblings when they were younger, and experts have attributed her anger to that abuse, for which he was later arrested and convicted. But in prison, it seems as though Loveless has found some measure of escape from the cycle of violence and abuse. An Indiana program called Indiana Canine Assistant Network has been helping Loveless. Behind bars, she trains puppies to be assistance dogs for disabled people. One of the dog breeders who supplies Indiana with pups is a burn victim, much like Shonda Scherer was. The breeder convinced Vaught to watch a video of Loveless grown up and see what she does in prison for the program. I was really taken aback, Vaught said after watching. I saw someone almost reborn. She was sincere. She was compassionate. I think the Indiana Canine Assistant Network program allows her to have something in her life that she can show love back to, and there's never betrayal on either side. Vaught did something remarkable after seeing her daughter's killer at work. She donated a puppy named Angel for Loveless to train in prison. The grieving mother said she did it to honor her little girl, who she still thinks about every day. It's my choice to make. She's my child. If you don't let good things come from bad things, nothing gets better. And I know what my child would want. My child would want this. Loveless, for her part, feels as if Vaught is helping her to overcome her past. She helped me to heal, forgive, and grow, whether she wanted that or not. She did a good thing. I would thank her. I couldn't thank her enough. Angel is in good hands, and I'm doing it for Shonda. No one could believe that mild-mannered Charlie Brandt had mutilated his wife and niece until they discovered his grisly past. Charlie Brandt always seemed like a normal guy, until one bloody night in September 2004. At the time, Hurricane Ivan was barreling toward the Florida Keys, where the 47-year-old Brandt lived with his wife, Terry, 46. They evacuated their home on Big Pine Key on September 2nd to stay with their niece, 37-year-old Michelle Jones, in Orlando. Michelle was close to Terry, her maternal aunt, and was excited to welcome her and her husband as house guests. Michelle was likewise close with her mother, Mary Lowe, with whom she spoke on the phone almost every day. When Michelle stopped answering her phone after the night of September 13th, Mary Lowe grew concerned and asked Michelle's friend, Debbie Knight, to go to the house and check on things. When night arrived, the front door was locked and there was no answer, so she made her way to the garage. There was a garage door with almost all glass, so you could see in, Knight recalled. I was in shock. There inside the garage, Charlie Brandt was hanging from the rafters. But Charlie Brandt's death was just one of the horrible deaths that had happened inside that house. When authorities arrived at the house, they found a scene that looked like something out of a slasher movie. Charlie Brandt had hung himself with a bedsheet. Terry's body was on the couch inside, been stabbed 7 times in the chest. Michelle's body was in her bedroom. She had been decapitated, her head placed next to her body, and someone had removed her heart. It was just a nice home, lead investigator Rob Hemmert recalled. All of those nice decorations and the aroma of her home was masked by death. The smell of death. Yet, with all this bloodshed, there were no signs of a struggle or forced entry, and the house was locked from the inside. Thus, with 2 people killed and 1 having killed himself, authorities quickly determined that Charlie Brandt had killed his wife and niece before committing suicide. But no one seemed to expect anything like this from Charlie Brandt, Mary Lowe said of her brother-in-law, who she'd known for 17 years, when they described what had happened to Michelle. It was even beyond description. Likewise, Lisa Emmons, one of Michelle's best friends, couldn't believe it. He was just very quiet and reserved, she said of Charlie. He would just sit back and observe. Michelle and I used to call him eccentric. Not only did everyone find Charlie Brandt nice and agreeable, they all felt like he and Terry had the perfect marriage. The inseparable pair did everything together, fishing and boating near their home, traveling, and so on. No one had any explanation for Charlie Brandt's behavior. Then, his older sister came forward. Angela Brandt was 2 years older than Charlie, and she harbored a dark secret from their Indiana childhood that no one knew about until she told her story. In an interrogation with Rob Hemmert, Angela cried before steeling her nerves and telling her story. It was January 3rd, 1971. At 9 or 10 p.m., Angela said, "We had just gotten a color TV. We were all sitting around watching the FBI with Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. after the TV show was over. I went and got in bed to read my book like I always did before I went to sleep." Meanwhile, Angela and Charlie's pregnant mom, Ilse, was drawing a bath and their dad, Herbert, was shaving. Then, Angela heard loud noises, so loud that she thought they were firecrackers. Then I heard my father yell, "Charlie, don't!" or "Charlie, stop!" And my mom was just screaming. The last thing I heard my mom say was, "Angela, call the police." Charlie, 13 at the time, then came into Angela's room holding a gun. He aimed a gun at her and pulled the trigger, but all they heard was a click. The gun was out of bullets. Charlie and Angela then began to fight, and he started to strangle his sister, which was when she noticed the glazed look in his eyes. That terrifying look disappeared after a moment, and Charlie, as if emerging from a trance, asked, "What am I doing?" What he had just done was walk into Parent's bathroom, shoot his father once in the back, and then shoot his mother several times, leaving him wounded and killing her. At the hospital in Fort Wayne just after the incident, Herbert said he had no idea why his son would do this. At the time he shot his parents, Charlie Brandt seemed like a normal kid. He did well in school and showed no signs of underlying psychological stress. The courts, which couldn't charge him with any criminal offense, given his age, ordered that he undergo many psychiatric evaluations and even spend more than a year in a psychiatric hospital before his father secured his release. But none of the psychiatrists ever found any mental illness or any explanation at all as to why he'd shot his family. The records were sealed because of Charlie's young age, and Herbert told his other children to keep things quiet and moved the family to Florida. They buried the incident and put it behind them. Anyone who knew the secret never told, and Charlie seemed fine afterward. But it seems he had been harboring dark urges all along. After he killed his wife and niece in 2004, authorities investigated Charlie's house on Big Pine Key. Inside, they found a medical poster displaying the female anatomy. There were also medical books and anatomy books, as well as a newspaper clipping that showed a human heart, all of which recalled some of the ways in which Charlie had mutilated Michelle's body. Searches of his internet history revealed websites focused on necrophilia and violence against women. They also found lots of Victoria's Secret catalogs, which proved especially troubling after they learned that Victoria's Secret is the nickname Charlie had given to Michelle. Knowing what he did to Michelle and then finding those things, Hemmert said, "It all started to make sense." Investigators believed that Charlie had become infatuated with Michelle and that his desires had taken a murderous turn. Hemmert, for one, believes that Charlie Brandt had always had these kinds of deadly desires, and that he was probably a serial killer. It's just that his other crimes never came to light. Authorities believe that he may have been responsible for at least 2 other murders, including one in 1989 and 1995. Both murders involved mutilations of women in a similar method to Michelle's murder. The Canadian porn actor Luca Magnotta, who's suspected of murdering and dismembering a Chinese student and mailing his body parts to Canada's top political parties, was reading about himself on the internet when he was arrested Monday at a cafe in Berlin, Germany. There was a horrid stench coming out of the suitcase. It had been there for days now. The janitor had noticed it every time he swept out in the alleyway behind the apartment building. Up until then, he'd been able to ignore it. But the smell from inside was getting worse and worse. A choking, sickly stench, like a pig roast left out to rot. But nothing could have prepared him for what he found inside. A man's severed torso with the limbs torn off. The other parts of the dead man would eventually turn up throughout the late spring of 2012, but they would be found nowhere near that apartment in Montreal. His left foot would show up in a package wrapped up by the Canada Post, delivered to the offices of Canada's Prime Minister. The package carrying his left hand, on its way to the Liberal Party, would be intercepted just in time. But no one would be able to stop the right side of his body from reaching its destinations. 2 elementary schools full of children in Vancouver, British Columbia. Both schools would start their day by opening up packages of severed, decomposing human remains. It didn't take long to figure out who'd done it. Luca Magnotta, after all, had filmed his own murder. He'd uploaded an 11-minute video of himself, hacking Junlin to pieces onto a website called bestgore.com for the whole world to see. So the mystery wasn't as much a question of who had done it as it was a question of why. Luca Magnotta was born Eric Newman in Ontario in 1982. The new name was one he chose himself, a sort of reinvention meant to purge bad memories. He said there was some messed up stuff that happened to him when he was a kid. Nina Arsenault, one of Magnotta's few friends, has said. Magnotta, she said, was so disturbed with whatever had hurt him that he'd break into fits of punching himself in the face. It's hard to say what memory was torturing him so horribly. Perhaps it was that his parents abandoned him at age 10 and left him to live with his brutal and domineering grandmother. Or it might have been something from his teenage years when he was young and bisexual in a small Ontario town that didn't make that easy. Or maybe it was just madness. Magnotta, after all, had inherited paranoid schizophrenia from his father and had started hearing voices at the age of 18. Whatever it was that had left him disturbed, Luca Magnotta had done everything in his power to erase Eric Newman. He'd rebuilt his whole face through plastic surgery and thrown himself into a new life as a male escort and minor porn star. Even his family was worried. As his own aunt later said, he was a time bomb waiting to explode. Jun Len just wanted a friend. He was a 33-year-old international student from China who hadn't quite been in Montreal for a year by the time of the spring of 2012. When Luca Magnotta, now 29, contacted him, he was just happy to have a friend. He wanted to find someone with something in common, one of Lin's friends later recalled. He didn't deserve this. Magnotta claimed that the two met on the night of May 24th, after Lin responded to a Craigslist ad that the former had posted in hopes of finding someone interested in sex and bondage. That night at 9 p.m., Junlin sent one final text to a friend. The next time anyone saw him was in a video, uploaded to bestgore.com the next day, carrying the title "One Lunatic, One Ice Pick." As the video revealed, Junlin had been stripped naked and tied to a bed frame. While the music of New Order blared through the speakers, Magnotta hacked him apart with an ice pick and a kitchen knife. He then filmed himself both sexually violating and dismembering the body, while also allowing a dog to chew on the body, and allegedly even eating parts of it himself. Police have claimed that cannibalism is evident in an extended version of the video that they reviewed. Luca Magnotta was already being investigated for horrific acts of violence for more than a year before he killed Junlin. A group of online sleuths had been working together via Facebook to hunt down Magnotta because he had uploaded video of himself killing animals. A year and a half before killing Lin, Luca Magnotta had uploaded another video entitled "One Boy, One Kittens," in which he suffocated 2 tabby kittens to death with a vacuum and a plastic bag. Since then, the online sleuths had amassed an incredible amount of information to bring Magnotta down. They'd pulled metadata from his animal torture pictures, found evidence about where he was hiding, and shared it all with the police, trying to stop him before he killed a human being. It hadn't been hard for them to track Magnotta down. He'd done everything he could to build up his online presence. He'd created Wikipedia pages about himself twice, created his own fake fan pages, and spread rumors that he was dating serial killer Karla Homolka. The sleuths hunting Magnotta speculated that he'd likewise killed cats for the attention. There's this unwritten rule of the internet. It's called Rule 0, and it's you don't mess with cats, one of the sleuths told Rolling Stone. Another added, what better way to get famous than to F with cats? But when these sleuths contacted the police, there wasn't much of a response. As one of the vigilantes recalled, I'm told it's just cats. They brushed me aside. What else could I have done? In the end, I told them this guy is going to turn around and kill somebody. Of course, Luca Magnotta did turn around and kill somebody. And once the video of June Lin's death was confirmed authentic, police began hunting for the killer. After the janitor at Magnotta's apartment building found the torso, with papers identifying the victim nearby, police checked the building's security footage and saw their victim and their killer entering the building just before the murder. It didn't take long for police to arrive at Magnotta's apartment in the building, where they found blood on the mattress, bathtub, in the refrigerator, and elsewhere. He wasn't there, but they had their killer, and after matching the torso remains with those that had been mailed all over Canada, police also fully knew what had become of their victim. By that point, Magnotta had fled to Paris under his own name, easily allowing authorities to follow his trail. He then took a bus to Berlin, but police kept on his trail and would soon take him down. They found him in an internet cafe in Berlin on June 4th. When the police came in, Magnotta was Googling his own name, reveling in his own fame. Something forced me to do it. It just gave me this weird energy, Luca Magnotta told a psychiatrist while waiting for his trial to begin. Something just happened in my brain. Magnotta said that he and Lynn were lovers, sharing a night together when a black car outside filled him with a conviction that Jun Lin was a secret agent. Tie him up. Cut it. He heard a voice tell him, he said. Do it. He's from the government. Then, after he'd slit Lin's throat and chopped up his body, Magnotta said that the voices told him, give it back to the government, hence mailing the body parts to government offices. But it's of course hard to say if Magnotta is telling the truth. The details and organization of the crimes, another psychiatrist said, show that Magnotta was having anything but disorganized thought. Instead, other analysts said that Magnotta knowingly committed the crime for the attention, and that, for him, the problem was simply that negative attention is better than no attention at all. We may never know for sure what went wrong inside the mind of Luca Magnotta. His jury, though, didn't accept his insanity defense. In December 2014, they found him guilty on all counts and sentenced him to life in prison. But for the family of June Lin, Luca Magnotta's punishment will surely never be enough. I will never see his smiling face, said the victim's father, or hear about his new accomplishments, or hear his laugh. Jun Lin's birthday is on December 30th, and he will never be there for his birthday or ours. A quiet spring night in Kansas City's historic Hyde Park in 1988 was shattered when a man wearing nothing but a dog collar around his neck leaped from a second-story window of a Robert Berdella's house, where he was being held captive. He crashed to the ground and ran to a nearby meter maid, who called the police. Police secured a search warrant and proceeded to discover a cavalcade of horrors inside this unassuming house. Opening a second-story closet, they discovered a human skull, as well as human vertebrae, marked from where they had been cut with a bone saw. In the backyard, they discovered another human head buried in the ground, partly decomposed. When they ventured into the basement, they found large barrels stained with blood, as well as the personal belongings of 2 missing people and a stack of Polaroid photos depicting naked men being sexually assaulted and tortured. They also found a stenographer's pad meticulously detailing the abduction, torture, rape, and murder of 6 young men from around the area. This house, 4315 Charlotte Street, belonged to the Kansas City Butcher, one of the most deranged serial killers in history. Born Robert Andrew Berdella Jr. on January 31, 1949, in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio, the man who would become this terrifying killer grew up in a deeply religious Roman Catholic family in the early 1950s. From a young age, Robert Berdella was a loner. With his severe nearsightedness, high blood pressure, and speech impediment, he was an easy target for bullies in his neighborhood. This included his father, who would physically and verbally abuse the young boy for his lack of athleticism. However, by his mid-teens, Berdella had begun to gain some confidence. He had realized that he was gay, and though he kept this a closely guarded secret, it gave him a level of self-assurance. This confidence manifested itself in a rude and condescending attitude, especially towards women, that he would hold for the rest of his life. In 1967, Robert Berdella graduated from high school and started attending the Kansas City Art Institute. In college, he was finally able to express himself and was open with his homosexuality. Though he displayed artistic talent, he quickly got caught up in drug use and low-level drug dealing. It was also during this time that he began torturing and killing animals. After he received harsh backlash from the administration of the Institute for an art piece where he tortured, killed, and cooked a duck, Berdella left college and moved into a house in the Hyde Park neighborhood of Kansas City, Missouri. Using the contacts he made through his extensive pen pal relationships from his lonely childhood, as well as his knowledge of art, Berdella opened a store called Bob's Bizarre Bazaar, where he sold art, jewelry, and antiques from around the world. Throughout the 1970s and early 80s, Robert Berdella spent much of his time with male prostitutes, drug addicts, petty criminals, and runaways that he claimed to be mentoring. In reality, he was engaging in manipulative sexual relationships with young men. Berdella used his money and influence to create an imbalance of power in his relationships he would use to control these young runaways, many of whom had been prostitutes or had been sexually abused. Then, in 1984, the Kansas City Butcher claimed his first victim, Jerry Howell. Howell was the 19-year-old son of Paul Howell, one of Berdella's acquaintances from his art-dealing business. On July 5th that year, Berdella offered to drive the young Howell to a dance competition at a neighboring town. On the way, Robert Berdella plied the youth with alcohol, and then drugged him with Valium and acepromazine. He tied Howell to his bed for 28 hours, during which he repeatedly drugged, tortured, raped, and violated the youth with foreign objects. Ignoring his desperate pleas for Berdella to stop, he continued his torture until Howell finally asphyxiated from a combination of his gag, the drugs, and his own vomit. After Howell died, Robert Berdella butchered his body, leaving the corpse upside down overnight with cuts in major arteries to drain the blood, and then dismembering the body with a bone saw. He then placed the pieces of the dismembered body in separate garbage bags, along with assorted other trash, and left them out on the curb for garbage men to take away. Throughout this process, Berdella kept detailed notes of how he raped and tortured Howell on a stenographer's pad, something he would continue to do for all his victims. His next victim was one of the drifters that Berdella had taken care of and exploited for years, Robert Sheldon. The 23-year-old man arrived on Berdella's doorstep on April 10, 1985, begging Berdella to let him stay there. Berdella was not attracted to Sheldon, and though he did not rape him, he did restrain and torture him. With Sheldon, Berdella began his experiments on using chemicals to weaken his victims, leaving them helpless to his machinations. He bound Sheldon's wrists with piano wire in an attempt to permanently damage the nerves there, put drain cleaner in his eyes, and filled his ears with coal. He also placed needles under Sheldon's fingernails. When workmen were scheduled to come to Bob Berdella's house, he decided to suffocate Sheldon and dissect his corpse before disposing of it. The following June, Robert Berdella committed another brutal murder of one of his runaway acquaintances when he found Mark Wallace attempting to sleep in his shed. Berdella drugged Wallace and subjected him to high-voltage electrical shocks and stuck hypodermic needles into his back. Wallace died after a few days of this unrelenting torture, and his body was also dismembered and disposed of. The next month, another of Berdella's acquaintances contacted him wondering if he could stay at his house, Walter James Ferris. When Ferris arrived at Berdella's house, he tied him to his bed and tortured him by shocking his genitals with 7,700 volts of electricity for 2 days until he died from the abuse. The next year, Berdella ran into Todd Stoops, a former male prostitute who had stayed with Berdella in the past, at a nearby park. Berdella brought Stoops back to his place to grab lunch. There, Berdella drugged Stoops and kept him trapped in his house for weeks. He attempted to turn Stoops into a submissive sex slave, trying to incapacitate him through electrical shocks to the eyes, and by injecting drain cleaner into his larynx in an unsuccessful effort to render him mute, while repeatedly raping and sexually assaulting him. Stoops eventually died of blood loss after his anal cavity was ruptured by Berdella's fist. In 1987, Berdella continued this attempt with 20-year-old Larry Wayne Person, an acquaintance he made while working at his shop. The Kansas City butcher decided to kill him after Pearson jokingly referred to his practice of robbing gay men in Wichita. He drugged Pearson and continued his torture practices aimed at incapacitating his victims, binding, electric shocking, and injecting drain cleaner into his larynx. He also broke one of Pearson's hands with a metal bar. After 6 weeks of rape and torture, Pearson finally snapped and bit deeply into Berdella's penis during an act of forced fellatio. Berdella then beat and strangled Pearson to death. On March 29, 1988, Berdella abducted his last victim, a 22-year-old male prostitute named Christopher Bryson, who he had solicited for sex. Once he arrived at Berdella's house, he knocked the prostitute unconscious with a metal bar and tied him up. Bryson was subjected to the same torture and abuse methods as Berdella's previous victims. But Bryson knew how to gain Berdella's trust, eventually persuading Berdella to tie his hands in front of him rather than to the bed. Then, when Berdella accidentally left a box of matches in the room, Bryson grabbed them and burned through his ropes, leading to his dramatic escape through the window. After collecting evidence from the house and questioning the suspected killer, Robert Berdella was quickly arrested and charged with the murders of 6 men. Berdella accepted a deal where he pleaded guilty and revealed everything about the vile murders in exchange for life without parole, avoiding the death penalty. He died of a heart attack while incarcerated at the Missouri State Penitentiary on October 8, 1992, at the age of 43. So ended the life of the Kansas City butcher, one of the most horrific serial killers in modern history. On the evening of February 21, 2001, Ashton Kutcher was getting ready for a date. That night, he had plans to go out with a 22-year-old woman named Ashley Ellerin. But when he arrived at her Los Angeles home to pick her up, she didn't answer the door. Kutcher peered in the window to see if she was inside and saw what he thought was a red wine stain on the carpet. This didn't surprise him, as he'd attended a rowdy party there a few days earlier. When Ellerin failed to appear after several minutes, the young actor assumed he'd been stood up. However, Ashton Kutcher later learned that it was not red wine staining Ellerin's floor, it was blood. The next morning, Ellerin's roommate came home to find her body. She had been stabbed 47 times. Investigators later identified her killer as Michael Gargiulo, also known as the Hollywood Ripper and the boy next door killer. However, Gargiulo wouldn't face justice for his heinous crimes until 2019, nearly 2 decades after he brutally murdered Ashley Ellerin. Ashley Ellerin was born on July 16, 1978. She grew up in New Jersey after her family moved from California, and although she was the new girl at her school, it did not affect her confidence. According to her childhood friend, Carolyn Mernick, who wrote the book The Hot One, a memoir of friendship, sex, and murder about Ellerin's death, Ellerin was the kind of girl who looked like she knew how to have fun. I liked Ashley right away for a million unquantifiable reasons that, looking back, I can only describe as chemistry and timing. What else was there, really? She wrote. She had shiny dark hair and a round face, and she didn't rush to try to get in with the popular girls, or make too much of the curiosity she aroused by being new at school that year in the 4th grade. But while Ellerin and Mernick became fast friends in childhood, they gradually drifted apart after the Ellerins moved back to California during their sophomore year of high school. Although Mernick and Ellerin lost contact for several years, they reconnected around 2000. Ellerin was an aspiring fashion designer and worked at a local strip club, though she confessed to Mernick that, on occasion, there were arrangements that happened in hotels, too. Mernick also heard stories that Ellerin had been partying often and trying different drugs. Mernick said it was as if they were speaking different languages, with Ellerin's being the language of youth, risk, and sexual possibility. It was around this time that Ashley Ellerin started seeing Ashton Kutcher. Kutcher later testified that he first met Ellerin at a friend's birthday party. He was dating someone else, but he introduced Ellerin to one of his friends. Neither relationship worked out, though, and eventually, Kutcher and Ellerin made plans to attend a post-Grammys party together. They scheduled the date for February 21, 2001, the night Ashley Ellerin died. That fateful night, Ashton Kutcher last talked to Ellerin at 8:24 p.m. He told her that he was running late, but she assured him it was no problem because she still needed to dry her hair. When Kutcher called Ellerin again around 10 p.m. to let her know he was on his way, he couldn't reach her. He redialed her number multiple times, but she never answered. At 10:45 p.m., he arrived at her house in Hollywood to find the front door locked. I knocked on the door. There was no answer. Knocked again, and once again, no answer. Kutcher later testified in court. At this point, I pretty well assumed she had left for the night, and that I was late, and she was upset. That's when he peered in through the window and saw what he thought was a red wine stain on the carpet. I didn't really think anything of it, he said. Kutcher then left. The next morning, Ellerin's roommate, Jennifer DeSisto, returned home to find her body lying near the bathroom door. She initially believed that Ellerin was playing some kind of practical joke, so she moved closer and noticed that Ellerin was covered in so much blood that it had matted her hair and stained the carpet red. DeSisto called the police immediately, and investigators quickly determined that her death was a homicide. The question remained, though, who was the killer? It took police years to track down Ashley Ellerin's murderer. In 2008, a man named Michael Gargiulo was arrested after he violently attacked his neighbor, Michelle Murphy. Detectives later connected him to the deaths of Ellerin and 2 other women. The press gave Gargiulo several nicknames, including the Chiller Killer and the Hollywood Ripper. However, the one that stuck was the boy next door killer because he lived near his victims, stalked them, and attacked them in their own homes. In fact, Gargiulo had first met Ashley Ellerin when he spotted her trying to fix a flat tire in front of her house. He offered to help her change it, and then continued to show up at her apartment to repair other objects. He came by so frequently that Ellerin's roommate came to believe he was stalking her. Still, Ellerin was the kind of woman who wanted to see the good in people. Her friends described her as an amazing person who would make friends with everyone. Detective Tom Small, who worked on Ellerin's case, noted, "Probably someone came to the door, and the rest is history." She knew the guy, and according to the people who knew her, if she knew you, she would let you in. Gargiulo likely decided to act when he found Ellerin home alone on the night of February 21st. Perhaps he made a move and was rejected, or maybe he simply wanted to kill. Regardless of his motive, however, Gargiulo stabbed Ellerin 47 times. The wounds were so severe that she was nearly decapitated, but Gargiulo had managed to get away with the murder, at least for a while. Michael Gargiulo likely carried out his first murder in 1993 before going on to kill Ellerin in 2001. 4 years later, he struck again, this time stabbing his neighbor Maria Bruno to death in her home in El Monte. When her body was found, investigators noticed that her breasts had been cut off and the implants removed. Then, in 2008, Gargiulo attacked Murphy in her Santa Monica apartment. She managed to fight him off, and he ran away, leaving a bloody trail behind him. After years of delayed trials, Michael Gargiulo was found guilty of Ashley Ellerin's murder in August 2019 and sentenced to death, largely thanks to the testimony of none other than Ashton Kutcher. If you enjoyed the video, please show your support by subscribing and liking the video, and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any future uploads.